Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. Welcome this President's Day to another edition of the show. Thank you so much for being here. As always, you can go to facepalmamerica.com for more information. And hail to the chief of wisdom and historical and political knowledge, as we do each Monday here on Facepalm America, the host of Around the Political World with John Rothmann, the aforementioned John Rothmann. Welcome, sir. How are you?
And wonderful, and a happy President's Day to you and to all of your listeners. Of course, the question is, what president are we celebrating?
Well, no, that's a good question. As I understand it, and I did want to get into the history of this a little bit, it is sort of, as it stands currently, a consolidated holiday around Washington and Lincoln's birthday. But it was not always such, was it, John?
No, I can remember very well when February 12th was Abraham Lincoln's birthday and February 22nd was George Washington's birthday. And I must tell you a quick story. My brother was born on February 22nd. And when I was in first grade, my teacher said, "You're going to have the day off tomorrow." Okay, fine. I want you to find out why you have the day off. So I went home and I'm talking to my family and I said, we have tomorrow off. Why do we have tomorrow off? My brother said, "Well, it's my birthday." And February 22nd, I go, fine. So I went to school, and of course it was a time to ask the question, why do we have the day off? And I raised my hand, me. And the teacher says, Johnny Rothmann, yes, it's my brother's birthday. I have never believed a word my brother has told me ever since.
Why is today different than all other days? It's a question that we have to ask ourselves.
Of course, I was fascinated by the poll which came out today, which showed the top three consistently, by the way, in every poll. They are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yes.
And in any particular order, you can argue any way. But what's interesting is the worst president of the United States in this poll, which normally had James Buchanan or Franklin Pierce at the bottom, in this poll, Donald Trump took the honors. Worst president in American history.
That does not surprise me in the least. I mean, he is definitely in the bottom quadrant, probably the bottom five. I think, given the position and the timing of his presidency and his inaction in the face of the impending storm, I would still tend to go for James Buchanan. But one can debate such things. It's interesting to think about that, because like we have our top presidents and our bottom presidents. Clearly, Lincoln and FDR, because they were so critical in expanding the powers of the federal government and fundamentally changing our conception of
and
how
George Washington.
Oh yes,
Washington created the whole concept. It's
right.
Amazing.
The two-term precedent, which was only finally ensconced into the Constitution after World War II.
22nd Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he put forward so many precedents, but it really is amazing and how thoroughly both Lincoln and FDR, I think, transformed what the preconceptions. Because prior to Lincoln, and of course, this is largely because of the Civil War, we thought of ourselves as a collection of individual states, and both he and the war changed that in a big way. But he also gathered the forces in order to win the war of a central government, a federal government, which had not existed in any substantive way prior to that point. I mean, it's difficult to think about what the United States was like before Lincoln and the Civil War and him engaging in those acts, creating these enormous armies, which just had never existed at that scale before. All the requisitions of materials that had to come together, the enormous, increased power of the federal government, the War Department, just an amazing number of things.
Everything. Yeah. And of course, there's another reality, and I thought about this because near great presidents, and interestingly enough, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, all fall into the near great category. And let me explain the logic here. Truman, of course, who had one of the most monumental presidencies in American history, and who achieved so much during his years. By the way, you know the old slogan, "Who lost China?" The Republicans tried to hang that on Truman. Well, I'm telling you, the Republicans are going to have a problem now with who lost Ukraine unless they get cracking.
Right.
Now, and Eisenhower, whose 8 years are absolutely phenomenal in terms of their sense, and then John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy's term was cut short, but why is he ranked as a near great? Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
The whole world could have been blown up.
Yeah.
But he saved it. And of course, although he didn't live to see it, he was the architect of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Medicare, which came in 65. So there are all of these fantastic opportunities to discuss the presidency.
Yeah, and I love discussing it with you. I know also that you are a great scholar of the vice presidents. So I am interested in getting your rankings, or at least the top and the bottom in terms of who is the best vice president, who is the worst vice president, and let's limit that if we could to a discussion rather than the vice presidents who became president, like what they actually did when they were in the vice presidency. And I know that most of the time, as we have discussed before in this program, that is precious little. But there are some exceptions to that.
You know the mother who had two sons.
Yes.
One went to sea, the other became vice president, and neither one was ever heard from again. Or Harry Truman, who once remarked that the vice presidency is about as useful as a cow's fifth teat. And you can go on and on. John Nance Garner, by the way, I'm going to clean it up. It wasn't that he said the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. He said the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm, well, I'll clean that up a little bit too, piss. So the reality is there is no such thing as a great vice president. Yeah. There is no such thing as a vice president who can really be ranked in terms of a magnificent achievement. But what is interesting is the odds makers. Now, let's assume for a minute that you and I were in a legitimate business. We were in the insurance business. And let's assume we had an actuary table and we were judging two men running for president of the United States who were in their 80s. And I'm going to just, although I shouldn't do it, I'm elevating Donald Trump by a couple of years. What do you think the odds are that they would finish a 4-year term? Which means, my dear friend, that what we're really looking at is the vice presidency. Now, you know, in 1944, Democratic powers that be wanted Henry Wallace out, and Roosevelt dumped him for Harry Truman. And when you think about all the history of Henry Wallace, it was a very good thing that Wallace did not become president. But question becomes, when we go to the polls next November, what are we really voting for? You know, they said about Truman, to err is Truman. They said he was the senator from Pendergast.
Yeah.
He came in knowing nothing. And yet we were saved literally by Democratic backroom politicians who didn't like Henry Wallace. And so Truman was nominated. Now, let's assume for a minute that Kamala Harris is the Democratic nominee for vice president, which I think is an absolute sure bet. Or let's even go further and say that all of a sudden Joe Biden can't run. Kamala Harris will pick up the marbles. She will be the Democratic candidate for president. And somebody asked me, how do I judge Kamala Harris? One of her very close friends, in fact, who I spoke to the other day about this. And I said, she's fully capable. I've known her. He's known her. We know. And you can't measure a person in terms of what they would do as president until they're in the Oval Office. So that's interesting. Now, the question is, who will Donald Trump choose? Now, I was intrigued this week, fascinated by the fact that many of those contenders for the vice presidency are asked the same question. If you had been vice president instead of Mike Pence, would you have done what Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do, which is to throw out the returns?
Right.
And the answer is that Elise Stefanik, who is, I think, the leading candidate, number 3 Republican in the House, said she would go along with Donald Trump. I would remind you that this is profoundly disturbing, that the candidates for vice president who are pitching for the vice presidency are all demonstrating their loyalty to Donald Trump. Absolutely. So this is going to be a question, too. And I think in this campaign, and I may be more used to you than ever before. The question will be, if you're voting for Trump or Biden, what about who are you voting for vice president?
Yeah.
Because that's the key. Let me also make a comment. As you know, there was a major story yesterday in the New York Times urging Joe Biden to step aside, and because of age, not because of his record, but because of his age. And you and I know it's very hard to give something up when you're in the center of power.
Yeah.
It's just hard to do it. We've seen example after example after example. Joe Biden, unless something dramatic happens, is going to be the Democratic nominee for vice president. Oh, did I say vice president? You see how easy it is to slip from the presidency to the vice presidency? Why? If Joe Biden is the nominee, Kamala Harris goes front and center. So my expectation is we're going to have an interesting thing. Now, one of the suggestions made by this columnist of the New York Times was, what happens if Biden withdraws at the last minute? Would we have an open Democratic convention? Let me remind you, the last really open convention we had was 1952, when Harry Truman withdrew and Adlai Stevenson ultimately got the nomination.
Yeah.
But I'm going to suggest to you, an open convention today is very different than an open convention then. Why? First of all, there are no favorite son blocks. In other words, there's no place to go to pick up delegates.
And there are very few precedents for like exactly how that would work in an era. I mean, 1952 was really before. I mean, that was just at the dawn of the television era. How would that interact with the media? There's so many questions about how that would function given an absence from the political scene of 70 plus years.
Right. And if you have an open convention, it is fascinating to consider. But I don't believe there will be, and I'll tell you why. I think that the Trump reality for the Democrats means they have to unify. And Kamala Harris is the one person who has been the carrier, if you will, of the Biden mantle. Stop and think where she is this week in Germany for a meeting of tremendous importance, dealing with Russia, dealing with the death of Navalny, dealing with the question of the future of NATO. I believe that if Kamala Harris is the nominee, there will be a tremendous move forward. But here's my question, and I haven't even thought about it till now. So Kamala Harris emerges as the nominee for vice president, but then she becomes president. Mm-hmm. Who would she choose to be her vice presidential running mate?
That's fascinating.
And that opens up a whole other situation. By the way, you cannot have a candidate for president and vice president from the same state. You remember when George W. Bush chose Dick Cheney. Cheney was registered to vote in Texas. He had to shift his voter registration to Wyoming, which was the great tip-off. Well, Gavin Newsom isn't going to change his position in terms of where he is from as a state. So that means that for Kamala Harris, her people must now be considering what would happen if something happened to Joe Biden. Who would she nominate for the vice presidency in a Harris administration?
Yeah.
So do you understand why when I go to bed at night, I am fixated on the ifs, the possibilities, the incredible realities? And may I say, when we first talked about this, I got an email from one of your listeners saying, what are you guys talking about? I mean, this is crazy. You're all speculating. We better speculate. That's all I have to say.
Things come up which you would never think that would happen in the course of regular events, and you have to be prepared for such things.
This does mean something for me, though. You understand?
Oh, and it means something for me too, because I don't go into the depth that you do, but I am a huge history buff myself, and it's just amazing to think about how important vice presidents have been historically, and I think I have most of these dates right, but for an amazing period of time, like vice presidents were taking over for presidents just on an astounding basis. There was I think it was 1840. William Henry Harrison was succeeded by John Tyler, and then it was Taylor was succeeded by
Millard
Fillmore, and Lincoln was succeeded by Johnson. Garfield was succeeded by Chester
Allen Arthur.